Mae gyda ni griw o bobl fan hyn sydd wedi bod yn ymgyrchu neu'n gweithio proffesiynol yn y meysydd yma ac yn arbennig o wybodus yn sicr iawn mae dealltwriaeth nhw mewn sawl maes yn llawer gwell na fy nealltwriaeth i, a dwi'n falch iawn i bod nhw yma efo ni prynhawn yma. Dyn ni wedi clywed eisoes heddiw yn dod am yr argyfwng tai. Mae yna argyfwng tai yn wynebu ein cymunedau ni yma yng Nghymru ac ar draws y Deyrnas Gyfunol ac yn wir ar draws y byd. Mae'r argyfwng yma yn arwen at ddiffyg tai, lle mae pobl yn methu cael tai, methu byw yn eu cymunedau, a heddiw da ni wedi gweld y cyfrifiad yn dod allan yn dangos enghraifft fod poblogaeth yr ardal dwi'n ei gynrychioli, Gwynfor yn Gwynedd, wedi disgyn 3.7% dros y 10 mlynedd dwytha. Poblogaeth Ceredigion wedi disgyn 6% efo poblogaeth ymhlith plant yn enwedig a'r dosbarth y sector yna yr oedran sy'n gweithio yn disgyn yn sylweddol fwy, tra bod yr oedrannau hun yn cynyddu. Mae hyn i gyd yn clymu fewn i'r hyn oedd Taj yn sôn amdan, sef yr elfen yna o fonyddigeiddio, yn benni gweld cymunedau yn newid oherwydd grym pres yn symud fewn a gorfodi pobl allan. Mi fydd rhai ohonoch chi'n ymwybodol wrth gwrs mod i wedi bod yn ymgyrchu ers sawl blwyddyn ar y mater ail dai. Wrth gwrs mae'r mater ail dai ddim yn gyfyngedig i Ogledd Orllewin Cymru a'n cymunedau Cymraeg ni. Mae o hefyd yn rhan o'r broses yna o fonyddigeiddio lle mae cymuned yn cael ei gwthio allan oherwydd nad ydyn nhw'n medru fforddio byw yn eu cymunedau hunain. Mae'r hyn da ni weld yn Abersoch, hefyd yn wir yn Rhebiwt ac hefyd yn wir yn Wrecsam a Glan y Dyfrdwy ac ar draws Cymru. Felly, dyna fydd sail y drafodaeth boneddigeiddio a sut mae'n cymunedau ni'n newid o flaen yn llyged ni. Ar gyfer y drafodaeth yma felly, mae gyda ni Gwenith sy'n ddirprwy Gomisiynydd y Gymraeg, Leena Farhat sydd yn fyfyrwraig doethuriaeth ym Mhrifysgol Bangor, y Brifysgol Ore, dyna lle roeddwn ni, ac mae'n swyddog amrywiaeth ar gyfer y Democratiaid Rhyddfrydol hefyd, ac hefyd cael Ellis, bardd o Gaerdydd, sydd wedi dod i'r amlwg yn ddiweddar iawn ar ôl ysgrifennu barddoniaeth yn tynnu sylw at y materion sy'n wynebu gymuned o yng Nghaerdydd, ac wrth gwrs Taj hefyd. Felly na i ofyn yn eich tro i'r tri arall ohonoch chi, if you could give a 5-minute presentation, please, or up to 5 minutes, as much as you want of that 5 minutes. Mi na ni gychwyn efo Gwenith.
Diolch yn fawr iawn am y croeso, a diolch am gael dod yma i'r gynadledd wych yma heddiw. Mae'n sylwadau i mynd i ganolbwyntio ar gymunedau Cymraeg bregus, a mae gynnau 3 pwynt sy'n ei licio i wneud yn yr 5 munud sy'n gen i. Yn gyntaf, dwi eisiau sôn am fudoledd. Mae strategaeth y Llywodraeth ar gyfer y Gymraeg wedi pwysleisio ers rhai blynyddoedd bellach bod ganddon ni heriau o ran cynnal cymunedau Cymraeg oherwydd symud poblogaeth. Y tuedd bod pobl ifanc yn gorfod neu yn gadael eu cymunedau a bod pobl mwy cefnog yn symud i mewn, a heini yn bobl hŷn. A mae'r ystadegau yn dangos colled net o siaradwyr Cymraeg o'n cymunedau Cymraeg ni. A dwi'n credu yn ystod y cyfnod pandemig, mae gwaith ymchwil gan Adran Daearyddiaeth Aberystwyth, Prifysgol Aberystwyth, yn dangos bod pethau wedi mynd yn fwy difrifol. Y math o bethau sydd wedi digwydd yn gynyddol yn ystod y cyfnod mwyaf diweddar ydy cynnydd mewn ail gartrefi mewn cymunedau, ac wrth gwrs tai yn mynd tu hwnt i a allu fforddiadwy pobl ifanc i'w prynu nhw neu rhentu nhw. Mae yna ffigurau ystadegau right move yn dangos 126% o gynnydd mewn diddordeb mewn ail gartrefi'n rhai o'r cymunedau yma. Ond da ni yn gwybod am hyn ers peth amser bod yna broblemau o'r math yma yn cymunedau gwledig ni. Dydy enghraifft y ffaith bod 43% o ail gartrefi yng nghymuned Aberdyfi ddim yn rhywbeth sydd wedi digwydd dros nos. A mae'r cadeirydd y panel wedi sôn yn gynharach am Abersoch, lle mae hanner y tai yn ail gartrefi a'r ysgol lleol wedi cael, a ydych chi'n cael effaith o gafnu cymuned allan o'r ardal lle maen nhw wedi geni eu magu. Ac wrth gwrs mae'r iaith Gymraeg yn ffactor canolog mewn llawer y cymunedau yma. A'r ail bwynt ydy yr hyn mae'r Llywodraeth wedi wneud yn y cyfnod mwyaf diweddar yn misoedd ar flwyddyn dwytha o newid polisia i drethu mwy ar berchnogion ailgartrefi, ond hefyd polisia cynllunio lle mae rhaid gofyn a cyflwyno cais cynllunio i newid defnydd eiddo. A mae hyn yn rhywbeth da ni'n groesawu ac yn galonogol, ond mae'n rhaid i'r pethau yma gael ei monitro. Pa effaith mae hyn yn mynd i gael os ydych chi'n gosod mesurau cry mewn un gymuned Gymraeg, falla ar gymunedau eraill o gwmpas. A'r pryder mawr sydd gen i ar hyn o bryd ydy nad oes ganddo ni ddim arbenigwyr yn y math yma o senario yn monitro'n gyfoes beth sy'n digwydd rwan a beth sy'n mynd i ddigwydd. Da ni'n casglu data, oedden ni'n sôn am y cyfrifiad. Dyma y math o ddata da ni'n dibynnu arno fo, ydy'r cyfrifiad 2011. Ond mae angen i'r comisiwn newydd ar gyfer cymunedau gwledig sydd yn cael ei arwain gan y Dr Simon Brooks gael pobl sydd yn arbenigo mewn cynllunio economaidd sosio-gymdeithasol i wneud yn siŵr bod ni'n gwybod ac yn deall beth sy'n digwydd. Ac wrth gwrs, dio ddim yn gyfyngedig bod nhw'n ddifrifol iawn beth sy'n digwydd rwan mewn cymunedau gwledig Cymraeg. Diolch yn gyfyngedig i hynny, ond ni'n sgwrsio efo'r Urdd a pobl ifanc o'r Urdd a gwna enghreifftiau yna o bobl ifanc o drefi yn sôn am capel Cymraeg nhw'n mynd o ganol y dre mwyn gwneud lle i rhywbeth mwy datblygiedig economaidd a bod nhw'n teimlo bod nhw'n colli cymuned a mae yna ysgolion cae mewn ganol trefi a yr ysgolion hynny yn cael ei defnyddio ar gyfer pwrpasau heblaw addysg a pobl yn teimlo bod nhw'n colli canolbwynt cymuned mewn cae. Felly mae yna lot o waith i wneud a dwi'n meddwl bod fi angen stopio yma. Dwi'n teimlo bod yn 5 munud wedi mynd.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Gwenith. O, mae'n funud ar ôl mewn gwirionedd.
O, reit, mae'n wedi ni.
Ardderch, diolch yn fawr iawn, a dyna ni rhywun sydd yn siarad o brofiad yn gweithio yn y maes cynllunio ieithyddol a dallt anghenion cymunedol yn syliedig ar ddiwylliant. Diolch am hynny. Leena, os gan i dy gyfraniad di?
Iawn, yeah. So, well, di siarad yn Saesneg, but yeah. So, I was asked here to talk about gentrification, and I thought that was interesting because what is important when you're investigating that as a theme is to look at it in the local context. And if you search far and wide, there is not a lot of Welsh-only research around gentrification and the impact of that in Wales. Which then brings the question, we talk a lot about the second homes crisis, and I see it living in North Wales in a rural area by the sea and the rest of it. But that is just a subsection of the problem that is gentrification. And the bigger issue is not being addressed. It's not being addressed at any level. And how can it be if we don't have the means to do so? So, with looking at the local context and with looking at local history, what can we say that it means? For me, what I see is gentrification is translated in the actions that we see within our communities. Whether that's someone walking into the Tyrcach in Abersoch and complaining that, they walked in, everybody started speaking Welsh. Or if, I know, I'm a comedian. But it's also the fact that our Senedd members walk up the stairs of the Senedd in an area that is predominantly working class, predominantly an area where people will never see the inside of that building, the policies that come out of it, and that they don't work for those people who are local. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I've got the solutions to how we're going to run gentrification in Wales, but what I do see is that the approach that needs to be taken needs to be informed locally. It needs to be heavily looked at the lowest level. But equally, it needs to tie into other forms of policy. For example, if we want to understand local history, we need to look at actually preserving that and knowing what local history there is, diverse forms of local history, and how that impacts gentrification. What buildings are being taken away? What buildings are we losing? What fields have we lost? Currently, I'm not sure that's going to happen, but I'm the eternal pessimist rather, not eternal optimist. So yeah, it's all about hoping. So yeah, I'm excited to see what comes out today. A lot of people have talked about lived experiences, and I am interested to know how many people sitting in this room feel that they can identify a lived experience of an area that they have lived in being gentrified. Because a lot of people see gentrification, especially when it's talked about in the Welsh context, as being related to who you are from a racial or ethnic background, rather than the idea that it comes through a transformation of an area for people who are from a low-income background. That's something that's often missed in the argument here in Wales, so I'm interested to know what people think about that. So yeah, leave you to it.
Ardderchog. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Leena. A Leena fan'na wedi sôn, wrth gwrs, am y Senedd, a lleoliad y Senedd, a sut mae Caerdydd yn newid o flaen y llygynnu, ac yma mae gennym ni Cal sydd yn dinesydd y Gaerdydd ac wedi gweld y peth, felly Cal.
Thank you. Thanks to Shelter for having me here today. I'm going to read off my phone. I know that's not very professional. Thanks to Shelter for having me here today, and thanks to all the other panellists for being here, and you guys all for coming out. This is a well-needed discussion. Wages stay the same, or they rise by pennies, whilst rents skyrocket. Bankers and politicians are collecting big bonuses, and food banks are open and rammed out all up and down the country. I think this is a broken system, and it's breaking the country. The savage and cruel attacks on the working class have been relentless throughout this, what is now over a decade of Tory terror. The global situation is just as grim. I know that's not what we're talking about today, but I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm scared for myself, for my generation. I'm scared for the generations behind me, whose chances of owning a house are incredibly slim. And I'm scared for the generations ahead of me, who in old age won't have the security and safety and a warm place to live. Housing isn't a perk, like it's not a little treat you get when you do well. A safe place and a comfortable place to live, a home, is a human right. And the fact that it isn't enshrined as that still bemuses me till this day. You've got landlords that are demanding insane sums of money up front, or asking for home ownership guarantors, and not everybody's parents own a house, not everybody has that privilege, so they can't rent properties. There's a limited number of housing, and that's resulting in now, in Cardiff especially, we're seeing loads of high-rise flats being built that people either can't afford to live in, or they end up living in and paying extortionate amounts of money. Other than that, landlords buying up whole streets, turning those houses into small, tiny flats that are mouldy, damp, they don't have the right bin access and stuff, and this all ends up falling back as being the tenant's fault. The homeless crisis has grown horrendous in the past few years in Cardiff. I grew up in Cardiff, and I remember you would occasionally see a homeless person on the streets, and I'm talking 20 years ago. There was a few, but these days it's become ridiculous. And we live in a society, and as Taj was saying about rhetoric, the way these people are spoken about is dehumanising, and that is clear proof to me that there is a side out there that want this problem worse. I think Wales has an opportunity here to be a forerunner in advancing the human living situation in the UK. We have the space to build affordable housing, and we have the funds. So why won't the government and councils act? And the simple answer is profit. Our society is driven by profit. We are operating off an outdated economic structure that's heading with speed towards a collapse. But again, that's another topic altogether. It won't be the rich who feel the brunt of any of the decisions made in Westminster. They'll benefit from them. They'll always see the better hand in this situation. It's always the poor who feel the worst, and the workers and those who are too sick to work, who our society has a responsibility of care for. Waves of gentrification are crashing over cities, raising house prices and splitting up communities that have often been around in them for decades, if not longer. For me, these communities are what make a city great. We've lost enough to these tidal waves, and it's time we came together and worked out how to prevent the negative changes and effects of gentrification. I think the decisions that people need to make it quite easy. But again and again, every time we get a little bit of ground, the government and the fat cats stand in the way with more cuts to public services, more loophole laws for their rich buddies, and more big bonuses to bankers, and a unrelenting, obvious hatred for the lower classes. People make a country great, not profit. I look forward to this discussion with you all today, and I hope I can come away having learned some new things that I can take back to my communities in Cardiff. So thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you all of the panellists for your contributions. So I'm sure there are plenty of questions out there to the panellists, or I hope so at least. Anybody got, we've got a microphone in the back, anybody got any questions to the panellists? We've got one on the left here.
Diolch yn fawr, gobeithio bod chi'n gallu clywed beth fi'n dweud. Diolch i chi gyd fel panelwyr am eich sylwadau. Ac i ddod nôl at y broblem, wrth gwrs, i ni gyd yn llwyr ymwybodol o'r boniddigeiddio yma sydd yn digwydd. A hynny o ganlyniad i nifer fawr o bobl yn symud i fewn i'n hardaloedd gwledig ni, fel nath Mabon sôn ar y dechrau fel mae'r canran o'r bobl iau wedi gostwng a'r canran o'r bobl hŷn yn cynyddu. Ond dwi'n credu hefyd bod yna broblem ychwanegol fan hyn yn dos, ac un o'r pethau ni ddim yn siarad amdano, yw bod yr allfudo yr un mor wael gan yn pobl ifanc ni. A'r rheswm dros hynny, wrth gwrs, yw fod yna ddim swyddi i gael i'r bobl yma'n lleol. Felly, maen nhw'n gorfod heidio i'r dinasoedd ac i Gaerdydd i chwilio am waith. Felly, mae'n hen bryd mynd i'r afael. Mae hyn yn digwydd ar sawl lefel yn dweud. Llwn ni sôn am gynllunio, a mae hwnna'n rhywbeth arall dwi'n meddwl, pan bych chi'n edrych ar yr holl adeiladau gwag sydd gyda ni ar draws y wlad. A dwi'n gwybod, dwi'n byw yng Ngorllewin Cymru hefyd, yn eitha gwledig, ac mae yna ardaloedd adeiladau gwag fyna hefyd. Felly, mae eisiau dod ar rhain ôl mewn i fodolaeth, ac un o'r pethau hefyd dwi'n meddwl yw cynllunio. Bod rhaid llacio rheolau, cynllunio ar rhai o'r eiddo yma sydd gyda ni mewn trefi a phentrefi. Dwi'n gwybod dwi'n byw ar stryd lle mae'n ardal gadwriaethol, a mae yna gyfyngiadau ar yr hyn allwn ni wneud i'r cartre yna. Ond wrth gwrs i ni'n gweld bobl yn mewnfudo ac arian sbar yn eu pocedi sydd yn medru fforddio wneud yr atgyweriadau yma yn y blaen. Felly y cwestiwn am o'n ni dwi'n gofyn yw, chi'n bod chi ddim yn gallu rhoi mewn un dror, ond mewn rhywbeth ar draws sawl sector, dwi. I ni'n sôn am gynllunio, i ni'n sôn am ddatblygu cymunedol, ac i ni'n sôn hefyd, i ni'n sôn am y gof nawr yn dweud i fod yn mynd i ddod mewn a dweud bod rhaid i berchnogion tai sydd am i troi nhw yn Airbnb, bod nhw'n i orfod gael caniatâd cynllunio. Os na bethau fel, beth yw ymarferoldeb rhoi cap ar y nifer o gartrefi Airbnb sydd mewn ardaloedd. A felly bod hwn o bosib yn gwestiwn i tythau Mabon gan dy fod ti wrth gwrs yn Llywodraeth Cymru. A beth yw'r pethau ymarferol i ni'n gallu wneud i fynd i'r afel ar broblem?
Iawn, dyna chi gyfres y gwestiwn efo. Mi ddoi nôl efo marn ni ar y diwedd, hefyd ydych chi eisiau clywed y criw yma. Sôn yn fanno am allfudo o gymunedau, oherwydd swyddi, angen newid cynllunio mwyn sicrhau fod tai ar gael yn mhob cymuned ac defnyddio asiadau cymunedol ac i fod o'n beth draws adrannol o ran llywodraeth. Dyna'n fras oedd yr hyn oedd yn cael ei ofyn. Felly, Taj, beth ydy dy syniadau di o ran yr hyn oedd Heather yn ofyn?
Thank you for those questions. I think the first thing to talk about when we talk about gentrification is it has a root cause, and one of the root causes is derelict buildings, is deprivation, is high levels of poverty, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's often justified that the area needs investment and anything can be better than what we currently have. And I think one of the big issues that we have is we have a lack of community power. I think we tend to forget that when we talk about these rich investors who build these very expensive properties that don't cater to the local population, we forget that wealth is produced by local people. We forget about the local economy. And I'm very keen on community wealth building, developing enterprises that actually benefit the local community. And even in an era of austerity, even in an era of cuts, there are many councils, especially in England, for instance, if we look at Preston Council and Salford Council, what they've done is when they look at planning permission and procurement, they say to the developers that actually we will only give you planning permission if that development will actually benefit local people. Show us how your development is actually going to benefit local people who are struggling with, for instance, youth unemployment. Show us how you are actually going to develop our area. And I think, as much as councils are feeling the pressure, I do think they do have some agency, and I think it's important that we, as communities, we actually put that pressure on them. So in Luton, for instance, we have an amazing group called Marsh Farm Outreach. Marsh Farm is a council estate in Luton which suffers very high levels of deprivation. And the residents got together and actually challenged the council. They actually squatted a 19th century farmhouse which became derelict, and it had dry rot in it. And they actually done it up themselves, and they said, what is your future use for this building? Because if you're not going to use it and it's been derelict, we'll take it over. And they actually got an agreement with the council. The council agreed to fix the dry rot. That building now is home to 8 social enterprises. It has a community radio station. I run a podcast from that place. It has a restaurant, it has a bar. It's a hub for the local community. And that's a positive story of local residents working with councils to improve local areas.
Thank you very much.
Ie, diolch yn fawr. Mae yna un prosiect peilot sydd wedi digwydd yn ddiweddar, dwi'n meddwl, yn Nwyfor. Mae Llywodraeth wedi ceisio edrych yn llorweddol ar draws problemau gwaith, economi, tai. A dwi'n meddwl na'r ymgais maen nhw wedi gwneud ydy ceisio cael datrysiadau lleol i gymunedau yn yr ardal yna. Ond un prosiect yw hwnna, a mae yna fwriad i defnyddio'r comisiwn newydd ar gyfer cymunedau Cymraeg i edrach yn ehangach. Ond ymhryder i ydy, mae pwyllgor fydd y comisiwn dan arweiniad rhywun, ac mae'r broblem yn llawer rhydd i frifol i grŵp o bobl eistedd a trafod un prosiect peilot. Felly, tra bod fi'n llwyr gytuno bod eisiau edrych ar lefel cymunedol, yng Nghymru ar hyn o bryd, dwi'n meddwl bod ni hefyd angen arbenigwyr mewn adfywio economi lleol, bod ni angen deall yn dda be ydy'r ymyrraethau mae'r Llywodraeth yn rhoi i lle wedi weithio i geisio wneud rhywbeth ynglyn â'r ffaith bod prisiau tai lleol yn dal i godi tu hwnt i allu bobl i'w prynu nhw a'r math yna o waith sydd yn golygu adnoddau ac amser wrth gwrs mwyn mynd i'r afal efo fo.
Diolch, Gwenith. Diolch yn fawr. Leena, beth yw'r barn ni?
So Taja said a decent amount of what I wanted to say, but again, as I mentioned at the beginning, when you look at gentrification, you want to look at it from a local context. Now, across Wales, that shows a very different picture depending on where you are, and so as a result, the solutions cannot all be the same. And even to argue that they should be the same on a regional level is, I think, a bit problematic, because there is a difference between urban and rural gentrification at its very, very core, and the levers that you can use to actually help mitigate some of the issues. Some things, sure, can be similar. You have young people in both places. You have small businesses in both places. You have big businesses possibly in both places. But in Wales, we suffer from issues regarding transport links. We suffer with very poor broadband if you live in a rural area, sometimes even in an urban area. So actually moving businesses or trying to get businesses to go places that you want them to go is a really, really hard ask. And we suffer from an issue here in Wales whereby a lot of the time we have policy that would be great, but we don't have the means to implement it. The issue with that then comes is that a lot of the time it's passed down to the next authority. So you'll have UK government might say something, they'll pass it down to the Senedd and go, your problem. Senedd pass down to councils, your problem. Councils then sort of don't really know where to run. Sometimes it'll get passed down to a town council or to planners or whatever. And actually that passing of the buck is problematic. Gentrification at its core doesn't happen overnight. It's a progressive transformation of the community. So actually, for what we need to look at here in Wales is to draw that distinction between the two kinds of gentrification. I would personally stop calling the second homes crisis a second homes crisis and start referring to it as to what it is, which is gentrification. Because once you actually homogenise that as a definition, you can attack the problem a lot easier. I know we've had discussions around words for things here today, which is great because I actually have a slight background in linguistics. They are important, terminology is important, and I don't think enough attention has been paid to that, as well as the way that we distribute funding. We see, as someone who lives in North Wales, we look at all of these amazing funding projects that are going out in South Wales, and you don't hear about anything in your area. So you sort of go, well, people are just going to move up here and, use it as, use our area as a playground, as a holiday home area, whatever. But actually, it's not always as simple as that. And so I think actually one of the biggest problems, just coming back to the original question, is an issue of engagement and the way that engagement and community engagement takes place when planners, developers, whatever, are actually wanting to build. In Wales, I'm sorry, we're really bad at that. Our councils are terrible at that because the same people turn up and fill out the planning applications, and it's the same people coming in and filling out the surveys, and you're talking to the same people each time, when actually the community is much bigger than that. So actually I think one of the root causes that we need to look at attacking in Wales is community engagement.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Leena. And Cal, going back to that point about community assets and how things are changing, how have you seen Cardiff changing in front of your eyes over the last couple of years?
Well, in Cardiff, it's very much, and there are similarities that can be drawn between, say, a town in West Wales, a seaside town in Cardiff. As at the moment, what we're currently seeing in Cardiff is we're very much a university town. A lot of our income and business comes from the students. So over the summer, when the students are all gone, there's very little work, there's very little money, and there's very little opportunity, like a seaside town, but the opposite. I think my brother is from West Wales. He lives in Mabon and works in local pubs. He's 18 and he's struggling he lives with his girlfriend's parents at the moment because they can't find a place to rent. There is nowhere for reasonably priced for young people to rent. And that problem then comes back to the second home stuff, everything being turned into Airbnbs, which don't bring any money into the community. To be honest, they bring money into private pockets, individuals' pockets. That money, if there's no money in the community and there's no opportunity, young people are going to leave. But when you bring money into a community, you need to give young people the opportunity to enterprise, like Taj was saying. Show them that it can be done, which I think is the most important thing, is giving people the confidence and encouragement to be like, this is possible. You can build a successful business in these areas. You can live a happy life in these areas. You don't have to flee to the big city because we're exacerbating the problem all the time. But I'm not an expert on it in rural areas, neither am I on it in cities. But yeah, thank you.
No, but you have drawn attention to the fact that Cardiff is changing, isn't it?
Cardiff is changing daily. There's new buildings going up all the time. Let's talk about the amount of music venues in Cardiff that the council knock down Free Willy and do nothing with, or they build really expensive high-rise student flats that have cinemas and private gyms that no one from Cardiff can afford to live in. And then don't build any social housing for anyone in Cardiff. It's a really sad situation in Cardiff at the moment. I've seen a lot of my friends and their families being priced out, and that's really disheartening. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, hi everyone, Mia Holsing, Shlamai. I've been working in Cardiff for a long time, and we definitely see people being driven out of Cardiff because of the cost of rents. I mean, it's similar to what's happening in London, but in a slightly smaller scale. People are being driven out all the time. So I wanted to ask, what about rent controls? What's the panel's views on that and applying that across Wales? I think that would benefit not just Cardiff, but actually all communities across Wales to stop people being driven out.
Thank you very much. We had a discussion this morning on rent controls, so very topical. Cal, can we start with you? What are your views on rent controls? We've seen Cardiff specifically having the highest increase in rents in the UK, 40% increase.
Currently actually looking for a new house to rent, so I'm feeling the brunt of that now. Their
we were talking
prices
earlier about lived experience, so yeah.
And you know, landlords are asking for ridiculous amounts of money up front, you know, like some of them are asking for like over a month's rent up front. Who has 1,500 quid just laying around to put in a landlord's pocket and then rent on top of that? It doesn't happen. But rent caps, I think would be a great idea. I think it would be a great idea to put rent caps in and to really regulate the whole landlord industry as a thing, like, you know, and make it currently works for the landlords, but it doesn't work for the tenants, and that seems a bit ridiculous. If we're in that situation, the landlord is providing a service, do you know what I mean? And it's not being provided very well. The other thing we've got a lot of in Cardiff is letting agents, and they're like these really evil cabals of just out to mug everyone off at themselves. But yeah, that's my opinion on it. So thanks.
Diolch, Gad. So there we have lived experience, and your view is quite clearly that the cap on rent control would be beneficial.
Fantastic
for something like Cardiff.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I suppose on a national level as well, across Wales.
As a general policy.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Leena.
So I've done a lot of research around rent controls, and I really enjoyed the session this morning. And I think they are a good idea, but I don't think that rent controls alone are going to fix the problem, especially within the context of gentrification. It's a safety net, I will give you that, but in isolation, it's not going to be the only thing that's going to work. I think in Wales, the thing that we need the most, we have an unparalleled sense of community in Wales, whether that was in person before the pandemic, online during the pandemic, and now sort of this weird hybrid sense of community after the pandemic. Historically and culturally, that's how Wales has always operated. And I would love to see a sort of capitalisation of that sense of community to actually get communities to sit down and see what will work in their community, possibly with cool policy people like yourselves. I don't know. But I think that in Wales it needs to, like I said, it has to be a local solution because you need to understand the context in which you're trying to mitigate the issue. So rent controls would be great, but they need to be local, and at the same time I would actually devolve them down to councils. I don't think that one specific set of rules from Welsh Government is going to be the best thing for all of Wales because we have such a varied diaspora of living situations.
Diolch, Leena. Okay. Gwenith.
Byddwn ni'n cytuno hefo nifer o'r pwyntiau sy'n newydd cael ei wneud yn ochr i. Dwi yn bendant yn meddwl bod rhent a prisio sy'n allan gyrraedd pobl yn effeithio ar gymunedau a chymunedau Cymraeg. Ond mae angen meddwl am peth yn gyfansawdd a enghraifft mewn llawer o'r cymunedau Cymraeg does na ddim tai i'w rhentu. Felly does na ddim tai fforddiadwy yno o gwbl. Felly mae'r problemau'n sicr yn rhoi sy'n amrywio o gymuned i gymuned. A mae angen edrych ar lefel cymunedol. Dwi hefyd yn meddwl bod yna enghreifftiau dwi wedi gweld lle mae llywodraeth yn gallu gwneud gwahaniaeth. Dwi'n llwyr dderbyn y pwynt bod yna ddim un set o fesura. Ond os ydyn ni'n edrych ar beth sy'n digwydd, mae o'n bwysig bod ni yn cymryd cyfleon a gofyn a disgwyl i lywodraeth wneud pethau pan mae hynny'n iawn. Ond ni'n edrych ar, wel, dwi'n rhan o fforwm efo Comisiynwyr Iaith ac da ni'n cwrdd ar-lein Comisiynwyr yn Ewrop ag tu hwnt. Ac mae yna ddeddfwriaeth newydd i basio yng Nghanada dechrau'r flwyddyn. Yn ymwneud efo mudoedd a symud poblogaeth. Ac wrth gwrs yng Nghanada, Ffrangeg a'r Saesneg ydy'r ddwy iaith maen nhw'n ceisio cynnal. A doedden nhw ddim yn gallu cynnal cymunedau neu lefelau ieithyddol cymunedau Ffrangeg oherwydd y mewnfudo. Doedd pobl ddim yn dysgu'r iaith wrth symud i fewn, a maen nhw angen pobl i symud i mewn yng Nghanada. Mae problemau nhw wahanol, ond y pwynt yw mae'r llywodraeth wedi cyflwyno deddf mwyn cynnal a codi'r targedau ynglyn â'r disgwyliad i bobl allu defnyddio'r Ffrangeg mewn cymunedau sy'n yn Ffrangeg. Felly dwi'n meddwl bod rhaid i ni gael cyfuniad o bethau lleol a chenedlaethol, ond yn sicr mae angen gwneud cyfres o ymyrraethau brys, parhau wneud nhw, oherwydd mae hyn yn effeithio bobl mor difrifol, mor gyflym. Dwi'n meddwl na'r peth pwysig i mi ydy bod pethau'n digwydd ar y lefel uchel i gael momentum i mewn i'r newidiadau ar ymwraethol?
Diolch, Gwenith. Bob tro dwi'n clywed am drafod am Canada a dwyieithrwydd Canada, dwi'n hyd yn gysynu bod pobl Canada beth yn trin ar y jibwe a'r gogwyn a'r neithiodd cynhenid eraill. Taj, you mentioned rent controls in your opening contribution, so I would assume that you think it's a good idea. Can you elaborate a little on that, please?
I think when we talk about rent controls and tenants, we often forget that a lot of these people are struggling with the cost of living crisis. People are in insecure employment. We have the gig economy where people don't even know how much they're going to be earning at the end of a month, let alone knowing if they can pay the rent or not. So society has changed, and I think it's time that we acknowledge that and we change our approach in housing. We've got situations now where people are having to decide with whether they spend on basic essentials or whether they pay their rent, or whether they spend on heating their homes or whether they pay their mortgage. So people are having to make tough decisions, and I do think we need greater legislation, greater controls, both local and national, and I agree with a lot of what has already been said here. I don't have all the answers. I don't think this is going to be something that is perfect. I know there's a lot of concern around rent controls, but I think in combination with a number of other things, building more affordable social housing, ensuring tenants have greater power and greater rights, I think that can only be a good thing.
Thank you. Before we go to the next question, Heather did ask for my view. I could stand and talk all day about this, so I'll try not to, but I live and breathe this every day. In Gwynfor, people think about Gwynfor as a stunning constituency. We've got Snowdon there, we've got the coast. It's beautiful. We get people, millions of nights stayed overnight in Gwynfor, people coming on holiday. It is a fantastic area, and please come along, enjoy what we've got to offer in Gwynfor. But we've got significant homeless problems in Gwynfor. We've got a huge housing crisis. I'll give you one example. My office is absolutely inundated with housing queries. Week by week, we get hundreds of emails, people asking about appropriate housing, about housing in their communities. One example, a nurse in one of the small towns, married to a veteran with 4 children, so working good wage, public sector, and living with 9 and Tide, the grandparents, in an overcrowded house. And they can't get a house at all. They are homeless. And they live in a small town, beautiful small town, called Criccieth. And every time they wake up in the morning and go to catch the taxi for the bus, for the school, a quarter or a third of the houses they pass lie empty for most of the year, because they're either on Airbnb or they're second homes. And these people can't afford to live in their own community anymore. They're now having to move out of Criccieth, probably over to Bangor. And they've got no connections to Bangor, but that's where they might find a house. Now that's just one example of the dozens I get daily, the hundreds I get weekly. Down in Tywyn, walking along the street with a girl who was homeless, living with her father. On the seafront, 25 houses. Only 2 of them had people living in them full time. In Borthegest, Glyn Terrace, full terrace of houses, dozen houses, only 1 of them had someone living there full time. So you've got people in my community who are having to walk past these empty properties day in, day out, and they can't afford to live in their own homes and own communities. And that's why I've been pushing for a lot of what's been discussed here. Start of the year, I put a motion forward in the Senedd calling for rent controls. Sadly, that motion didn't pass, but the reason why we went into an agreement with the government was in order to resolve some of these issues, and the Welsh Government have now committed to bring together a white paper looking at rent controls as one of the options to solving the housing crisis in Wales. That's something we can do in Wales if we have the right ambition and the right will to do it. I put a motion forward last week in the Senedd on community assets and community asset transfers, so that communities had control over the assets, that they could develop housing projects in their own communities, on their own lands. Thankfully, that motion passed. Unanimously, nobody voted against it. Initially, the government said that they didn't really want to support legislation around it, so we sort of diluted it a little bit, but we're a step in the right direction. So there are things happening in Wales. When people look at politics in London and in England and the mess that we've got in Westminster, and it is an absolute mess over there, as you all know, they tend to forget what's going on in Wales and turn a blind eye, but things are changing in Wales, for the better, I'm glad to see. And we've got in Gwynfor pilot schemes going, where we will be able to use planning so that people have to apply for change of use if they buy a property and they want to use it for a second home or for a short-term holiday let. That'll be trialled with us in Gwynfor, and in fact, every local authority will be able to opt into that, but the funding to develop that idea will start in Gwynedd and with Gwynfor, so that we can start to take action. So we're seeing things happening here in Wales. It'll take a while, a long while, and it's better late than never though. That's the truth of it. Okay, sorry, that's my sort of sermon over. Unrhyw rhagor gwestiynau gyda chi fan hyn? Any more questions? Yeah, in the front fan hyn.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a little bit of an example and then ask your opinion on it. So I live just down the road from here, sleepy seaside town of Porthcawl. We've suffered what I call slight gentrification, a lot of people coming from England, Airbnbs, second homes. Bridgend Labour Council have put out a new regeneration plan for the area, and to be honest, it's pretty good. It doesn't go down that sort of gentrification route. It talks about affordable housing and recognising that when our young people go off to university, we probably only see about 10 to 15% of them ever come back. So, it's trying to encourage people to stay in the area. But it's the townspeople who are the ones who've risen up against that and putting the barriers in the way. It's that the NIMBYism really, not in my backyard. They don't like this affordable housing. They think it's going to bottleneck the doctor surgery and the infrastructure and all of those sorts of things. So, how do you win the hearts and minds of people to actually recognise when there is a good proposal in place and that, something positive may be happening?
Diolch yn fawr, that's a very good question. We were talking about this earlier, Taj, weren't we? About how people perceive social housing. Explained my own parents-in-law didn't want social housing next to them because they thought it was going to be full of naughty people, let's put it that. Absolutely untrue, but that's the perception. So Taj, can you sort of tackle that question, please?
So just to talk about Luton Borough Council, we've got Luton Airport in our town, and that, the airport invests a lot of money in the local community. At the same time, there are very real concerns with the expansion of Luton Airport. So there are many different interest groups in the town. And when we look at, for instance, social housing, to their credit, Luton Borough Council have a very ambitious, social housing agenda. They want to build more and more homes. But for one example, they've started to build on Wandon Park, one of the greenfield sites that is seen by many in the community as a local asset. So I think the problems arise when the people most affected by the decisions are not in the room having their say. So I think we definitely do have people who will oppose anything regardless, but we also have some people who have genuine concerns, and sometimes there is a conflict of interest, and it's important that we engage with those communities rather than, for instance, I know many councils will have a consultation and nobody will turn up, they won't advertise it, you'll have 2 or 3 people who might attend the meeting. In Luton, for instance, what I talked about Marsh Farm outreach earlier on, the way they do consultations is very different. They hire a bouncy car, so they have a party, they bring loads of people in, so they combine culture and arts and things that are really, really interesting, and they also consult local people. Glenn Jenkins, one of the people from Marsh Farm Outreach, he said, Taj, if you're inviting one of your friends to a boring planning meeting, you probably don't like them. So even the way we engage with local communities has to change. I think that's one of the ways to do it.
Thanks, Taj. Very good point. Leena, you touched this in one of your responses earlier.
So I did say that community engagement is really lacking in the way that we do it in Wales. I'm really impressed that you're a fan of what's happening in Bridgend, because everything I've seen has been opposing it, so I completely see your point on that one. I think that in Wales we don't bring our communities along with us. We need to recognise that sometimes there is a need for change, but there is a way to do that that does not gentrify a community. And I think you've also, so Taj touched on it, saying that, you know, a lot of the time the people that are affected are not in the room. Well, it's about, you don't need to be putting them in a room, you need to be going where they are. Because if they're not coming to your consultation, no matter how exciting you make it, in my case, where I live, we run a lot of our town council consultations at a market that we hold. So people are usually there to shop, but we usually have a stall just to sort of catch them while they're there, and we tend to get sort of 200, 300 people turn out, which is quite good for a community of about 2,000. I think in Wales we don't have that culture of going to where people are, but I think that's an issue. The other thing I would say is that we have an amazing set of town planners in Wales that we really don't hear enough from or about. So there is a rise now of moving towards creating place plans for different areas. It's something that's starting to happen in North Wales. In my local area of Conwy, we have five towns that are undergoing the writing up of place plans. Now they aren't legally binding like an LDP would be, but it's an opportunity to sit down with your community and see what people want, what are their priorities for the next 5 years, 10 years, however long you want to create the place plan for. And when a planning application comes into that community, how can it be evaluated against that place plan? It allows you to keep your county or even other higher powers accountable in your local community and help people actually understand and get on board with it. Sometimes you just have to try better at, convincing them of the fact that that change is good, and that is not an easy process. The one thing I would say though is you brought up the fact that you know that young people are leaving your community, and you know that there is that demographic change, when they go off to university or anything else they might be doing. I think that in Wales, we don't do a very good job of attracting people back or even attracting people from other places to come in. There's so much of an onus being put forward on making sure that certain demographics of people come back to Wales, and only those demographics are mentioned. But for those of us who actually have considered living here full time, it is infinitely more hard because of the sometimes vile outlooks from your community, who are scared of incomers in some places. And that's really, really unfortunate, because we need to be that start of that culture change to bring our communities on board, plan for the community, and allow that feeling of, oh, but they've moved here from somewhere else, that feeling will then dissipate, I think.
And we're seeing that with issues around Roma Gypsy traveller sites as well, where communities are afraid and opposing them quite often, even though it's the right thing to do, that people are choosing their own home, yeah?
Yes, and that we do have to look at those cultural differences when we look at housing. That's something that's not looked at in Wales, because different people live in different ways. I've seen that in my community actually, with the local councillor telling people to lock up their garden equipment because they're going to come and steal it, and how dare they go to the local supermarket to shop. Things like that. We need to look at the attitudes towards housing, and the different ways that it may come. But we had a conversation earlier on the table about homelessness and the fact that some homeless people can't cope with going into a house. And sometimes we just have to respect that. No matter how much you try, different people want to live in different ways.
Definitely on to Carl, so we've heard a lot of criticism about Cardiff, how Cardiff is changing over the last year or so. How do you think we can get the local authority and the government to engage with the people of Cardiff more, so that they play a part in the design of Cardiff?
I think, what you were saying about Porthcawl then, about you're planning to build social housing, and this problem with integration, getting people to accept a change that might be positive. Humans don't like change, do we? We're notoriously bad for it, And but I think it's really important that we do mix them communities. Have I got the answer to how we're going to do that? I really wish I did, But I think it's important that young people have a voice in it. That's a big one I'm seeing in Cardiff. Young people's councils, young people taking more action in their community, and getting involved in community projects, you know, whether that be community centres or arts and culture. They're the main two things that I think bridge that gap between government and the public.
So do you think there is enough engagement at the moment?
Oh, no. Look, we need a lot more. Look. Yeah, loads more. More bouncy castles.
Tangible idea, yeah. Gwenith,
Ie, dwi'n llwyr gytuno, dyna'r pwynt yn fan hyn ydy'r ymgynghori. Pan mae pethau'n dod i bwynt bod yna wrthwynebiad yn y gymuned rhwng grwpiau, mae oherwydd bod y corff cyfrifol falle ddim wedi gwneud digon o arwain a meddwl am ffordd ymgynghori. Mae Comisiynydd Gymraeg yn sefydliad sy'n weithio'n derbyn cwynion, mae gennym ni broses cwynion, a mae yna ddisgwyliad ar awdurdoda lleol ac yn blaen i ystyried y Gymraeg wrth wneud penderfyniadau polisi. Felly dyna pryd da ni'n weld o, mae pobl weithio'n dod ata ni i gwyno am ryw benderfyniad a ryw newid mewn cymuned. A dyn nhw heb bod yn rhan o'r ymgynghoriad, neu dydy'r iaith Gymraeg heb gael ei ystyried. A mae o'i gyd i lawr i ddiffygion estyn allan a cynnwys pobl. Ac yn sicr, fel o'n i'n deud yn gynharach, o'n i'n sgwrsio fo pobl ifanc o'r Urdd Dda mewn ysgolion uwchradd yn ddiweddar. Ac mi glywes i'r llaw gyntaf o pobl ifanc yn poeni am rhywbeth yn digwydd yn eu tre nhw, a doedden nhw ddim wedi cael eu cynnwys. Ac oedden nhw'n bobl abl oedd yn teimlo'n gry dros rhywbeth, a ddim yn gwybod sut i gyfrannu at y drafodaeth. Felly, yn bendant, dwi'n meddwl bod yna fwy o lawer i wneud i osgoi y gwrthdaro yn lle cyntaf a tynnu pobl efo ni.
Diolch. Ac i roi un enghraifft i chi, cyn i fi gael nethol flwyddyn yn ôl, oedden ni'n gynghorydd sir. A fydd nifer ohonoch chi'n ymwybodol beth i LDP yn Local Development Plan, ac mae LDPs yn gorfod cael ei adolygu bob 5 mlynedd. Wel, oedd y sir fyny arno yn adolygu yr LDP, oedd y cyfnod wedi dod fyny, ac o'r sir gyfan, efo dros 70,000 o bobl yn byw yno fo, 14 oedd wedi cymryd rhan yn y broses ymgymhorol yna o gyfrannu y tuag at adolygu'r LDP. Fi oedd yr unig gynghorydd sir, ac oedd yr 13 arall yn datblygwyr tai. Felly dyna i chi ddangos sut mae'r system bresennol yn cael ei sgiwio yn erbyn cymunedau ac o blaid datblygwyr a hefyd, swn i'n nodi, ar un peth arall dwi'n trio gweithio, efo gyda llawn y Senedd, rhywun sy'n eisiau helpu fi, ydy rhoi right of appeal i gymunedau. Achos ar hyn o bryd, os oes cynllun yn cael ei dderbyn, cynllun datblygu'n cael ei dderbyn mewn cymuned, yna, os di'n cael ei wrthod mewn flin gynnau, yna mae'r cwmni datblygu'n cael apelio yn erbyn y penderfyniad, ac yna mi eithaf ei wirdroi yn amlach na ffeidio, ac eith y datblygiad fynd yn ei flaen yn erbyn y wyllus cymuned. Ond os di penderfyniad yn cael ei dderbyn, does gan gymuned ddim hawl i apelio yn erbyn y penderfyniad yna. Mae rhaid ni newid y drefn yna mwyn grymuso cymuned. Wel, mae'n amser ni'n dirwyn i ben, dwi'n gweld, dyla'n desbryd eisiau dod mewn yn y cefn. Felly, un cwestiwn arall, atebion byr iawn os gwelwch yn dda, achos mae Lindsay'n edrych yn flin iawn o'r nefyn hyn. Yn y cefn. Di'r microphone ddim yn gweithio.
Hello. Okay, so to Cal specifically, I want to just ask, how do you find the creative medium to be a way of engaging people? And then to the panel more broadly, discrimination and inequality has been identified as key factors, whether that be a iaith Cymraeg, whether that be age, gender, race, or class. Does the Welsh Government have the levels of power they need? If they do, why aren't they using them? If they don't, what levels do they need?
Okay, that's a massive question. So unless we've got a couple of hours, and I know we've got about 30 seconds each, sorry, to try and sort of really wrap up this and answer the question. Cal?
I think the creative medium has loads of ways of reaching communities through it. The reason I'm here today is because I wrote this poem and I went around with some glue and stuck it up around Cardiff. Wales Online got in touch. They did an article, then I was here. It's been a strange ascent, but and I think I've done a lot of time, on picket lines, on streets, getting people to sign petitions and trying to get people to speak about politics. people don't want to speak about politics. It's really boring. The best way to do it is to get them to talk creatively, get them to use their imaginations, get them to see it in a bit more of a playful way. And for me, that's gotten a lot more positive conversations off people and conversations that have developed me as a person than I have. I've got that through art, not through, petitioning and whatnot. So thanks for the question. Cheers, guys.
So I'll break it down. You said talking about discrimination. So I see it as someone who lives in an area that is Welsh speaking. I'm Welsh speaking myself, and I've chosen not to speak on this panel in Welsh because I'm not represented by a lot of Welsh communities. I'm always by the wayside because I'm not white Welsh Cymraeg. So in terms of that, there is a lot of discrimination that is faced by Welsh speaking communities, but a lot of people who are looking at the Welsh language are not looking at it for the whole community. They're looking at it for the vast majority, and people fall by the wayside, especially in places like Cardiff. From a race and ethnicity perspective, I'm not ethnically Welsh, but from a race side is what I look at. Yeah, there is a massive issue. People don't want to engage. I spend a lot of my time trying to make sure that we do get a diversity of voices when we have consultations and the rest of it, but it is extremely hard. Do I think the Welsh Government have the tools to deal with this? I think they do, actually. At the moment, for the most part, they have the tools. Councils, however, do not. We don't actually make sure that enough powers are brought down to the council levels where councils have a say in local issues. Welsh Government could of course, do with some more powers, but at the moment, we've got all the means to fix it. They just sit on their hands about it.
Ond cyd-destun y drafodaeth heddiw, dwi'n meddwl bod cymhasu pobl sy'n symud i gymunedau yn bwysig a'r gallu i bobl fynd i addysg Gymraeg, dysgu Cymraeg yn hynod bwysig. Mae ffigyrau ac ystadegau cyfrifiad yn dangos cynnydd yn pobl o gefndiroedd ethnig lleiafrifol yn medru'r Gymraeg o 15 ac yn lawr. Maen nhw yn cael y cyfle yna i addysg Gymraeg, a mae angen gwneud llawer mwy. A dwi'n cytuno bod cymhasu yn elfen bwysig o'r drafodaeth.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Gwenith. And to wrap things up, please, Taj, just your final contribution.
Yeah, I think on the question of discrimination, I think unfortunately the fact that ethnic minorities have a lot less power in this society. If we look at, for instance, illegal evictions, we know they disproportionately impact migrant groups. One of my closest friends, his mother has English as a second language, and she felt her concerns were not taken seriously by the council or by the housing providers because they thought they could get away with it because they didn't know their rights. So I do think it's a question of discrimination, and it draws a lot of parallels, I think, with the plight of agency workers who work in factories, who tend to be migrant workers, who tend not to be unionized, and people in power thinking they can walk all over these people. That needs to change. We need to empower those communities that are often left behind.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Gobeithio bod chi gyd wedi cael rhywbeth allan o'r trafodaeth yna. Dwi'n sicr wedi cael ein cyfoethogi efo'r trafodaeth, a diolch i chi. Felly, os gan i ddangos diolch i'r panelists. Yn ôl i orffen at Lindsay. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Bendigedig. Don't get excited with your headsets, that's literally all I've got. Merry Christmas, but I'm trying, I'm really trying. Right, I need you to do me a favour, just while I'm getting ready to go into my 45-minute closing speech. You've got a QR code on your table, and that's going to give you a link to the feedback forms for this event. So if you don't mind having a crack at those for us, I'm sure it takes 2 minutes, so everyone's still going to get out on time. Also, I can talk really fast. Okay, closing messages, and just my thoughts on today, really. I think there's been a lot to swallow. I feel like I'm trying to eat an elephant here. I think there's so many issues that have been outlined in a sector that's been on its knees for a couple of years now, and it's about to get worse, and we're going to have to do more with less, and there's loads of problems that just seem immovable. But I refuse to accept that homeless means hopeless, because a lot of it does. I think if we look at the collective awesomeness in this room, there are solutions. We've seen some of those in the sessions that we've had this morning and this afternoon. We've seen solutions using creative art. I'm all about bouncy castles, and I'm all about refusing that hard to reach groups are hard to reach. They're not. They're right there, and they want to talk to us. We're just going to make some extra effort. the processes are there to help people complain. If you haven't got the energy to it, if you're just trying to keep alive day to day, you're not going to engage with that process. We are failing to engage with the people that we need to hear from, and that's the difference that I think is going to make the difference. I also want to recognise that some landlords do need a bit of a kick in, but we have allies. We have allies. It's not all landlords, it's not all housing organisations, and what we can do is celebrate that good practice. I've heard loads of conversations, let's get together, let's write something, can I visit your project, let's do this. And that's coming out of this room today. So it does feel like too much sometimes, I totally get it, and I'm in it with you. But I think the whole theme of the conference is making systems work for people. And the takeaway message from me is there's hope, there's a lot to do, and we know everyone's tired out, but there's hope for solving these issues. I would like to extend a warm thanks to Paul, our sponsor, for the event, and I wondered if you just put your hands together, please, for the Shelter Cover team. Don't lose your passion, because that's what's going to carry us through this. Safe journey home. Diolch yn fawr iawn.